Welcome back to another video where the darkest stories hidden in the shadows of seemingly ordinary lives are uncovered. Today, we dive into a case that will make you question the very foundations of what we call family. This is the macabre history of the Follings, a couple who adopted 12 children over 15 years, none of whom had birth certificates. What began as a heartwarming story of generosity unraveled quickly into something far more sinister. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to the Ghastly Journal and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly descent into the darkest corners of human history. Now let's begin. Nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, the small town of Millbrook was hardly the kind of place where you'd expect to find a story so disturbing it would eventually attract federal attention. With a population of just under 3,000, Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where community potlucks and high school football games were the social calendar highlights, and where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone fell ill. It was in this idyllic setting that Howard and Margaret Folling made their home in the spring of 1978. The Folling residence was a sprawling Victorian mansion on Elm Street, set back from the road and partially hidden by a copse of ancient oak trees. The house had been vacant for nearly a decade before the Follings purchased it, and the locals had begun calling it the haunted house on the hill. But Howard Folling, a successful investment banker from Pittsburgh, saw potential in the dilapidated structure. He and his wife, Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, spent a small fortune renovating the property, transforming it from a crumbling eyesore into the neighborhood's envy. They seemed like such a lovely couple, recalls Elaine Winters, who lived across the street from the Follings for nearly 20 years. Howard was always impeccably dressed, even when just checking the mail. And Margaret, well, she had this way about her, so poised, so elegant. They were the kind of people you'd want to invite to dinner, the kind who made you feel important just by talking to you. But beneath the veneer of respectability, the Follings harbored secrets that would eventually shock the entire community. According to public records, Howard and Margaret were unable to have biological children. This was a source of great sorrow for Margaret, who had always dreamed of a large family. She used to watch the neighborhood children playing from her porch, says Winters. There was something so sad about it, the way she'd just sit there for hours watching them laugh and run around. I remember thinking she would have made a wonderful mother. And indeed, it seemed Margaret would finally get her chance when, in the summer of 1980, the Follings announced they had adopted a baby boy named James. The community was thrilled. Neighbors organized a surprise baby shower, and the local church held a special blessing ceremony. James Folling was a beautiful child, bright-eyed and quick to smile, and the Follings doted on him obsessively. Margaret wouldn't let anyone else hold him, remembers Clara Jenkins, who attended the same church. Not even at his blessing ceremony. When the pastor asked to hold him, she got a look like a cornered animal. Howard had to whisper something before she'd hand him over, and even then, she stood so close she was practically breathing down his neck. In retrospect, this possessiveness might have been the first red flag, but at the time, it was dismissed as the natural protectiveness of a new mother who had waited so long. Within 2 years, the Follings adopted a second child, a girl named Elizabeth, and then in rapid succession came Thomas, Catherine, and William. By 1985, the Follings had 5 adopted children, all under 6. The speed of their adoptions was unusual, especially given Pennsylvania's typically lengthy process. But Howard Folling was wealthy and well-connected, and the couple had an impeccable reputation. They were seen as saviors, says Detective Richard Cooper, who would later lead the investigation. Here was this wealthy couple taking in children who might have grown up in the system. Who was going to question that? Who would want to? But oddities, in hindsight, should have raised concerns. None of the Follings children attended public school. Margaret insisted on homeschooling. The children were rarely seen in town, and when they were never allowed to stray far. They didn't participate in sports or activities and had no friends outside the family. I remember trying to arrange a play date for my son with James Follings, says former resident Patricia Hayes. They were about the same age, and James seemed so lonely, but Margaret always had an excuse. After a while, I stopped asking.
We must consider
The children's
risks.
isolation might have continued indefinitely if not for an accident in the summer of 1987. 9-year-old Thomas Follings fell from a tree and broke his arm. Margaret, despite her nursing background, didn't take him to the hospital. Instead, she attempted to set the bone herself, resulting in a compound fracture that became infected. Only when Thomas developed a dangerously high fever did Howard overrule his wife and take the boy to the emergency room. Dr. Sarah Chen was the attending physician at Millbrook General. The child was in septic shock by the time he arrived. Dr. Chen recalls, "We had to perform emergency surgery to save his arm. What struck me most, though, was the boy's reaction. He didn't cry. Not once. And when I asked how he'd broken his arm, he looked at his father before answering. It was as if he was waiting for permission to speak." Dr. Chen's concerns deepened when she asked for Thomas's medical records and was told they didn't exist. According to Howard, all the children's records had been lost in a fire at their previous adoption agency. When Dr. Chen pressed, Howard became agitated and threatened to transfer Thomas. "That's when I knew something was wrong," says Dr. Chen. "But I had no proof, only suspicions. And in a town like Millbrook, suspicions about a family like the Follings could damage your career." Nevertheless, Dr. Chen filed a report with Child Protective Services. A caseworker named David Morris was assigned to investigate. Morris visited the Follings home, interviewed the parents, and observed the children. His report, filed 3 weeks later, concluded there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. The children appeared healthy and well cared for. Morris wrote, "Mrs. Follings explained she initially tried to treat Thomas's injury herself, due to her medical background and a fear of hospitals. While this decision was ill-advised, it does not constitute willful neglect." The case was closed. Life in Millbrook returned to normal. The Follings continued expanding their family, adopting 3 more children between 1988 and 1990. Robert, Ann, and Henry. By now, some in the community were whispering, how were they able to adopt so many children so quickly? Why were the children so rarely seen? And why did they all share the same vacant expression? "I used to watch them at church," says Jenkins. 8 children, all sitting in a perfect row, not fidgeting, not whispering. They just sat there staring straight ahead. It was unnatural. But if the community had questions, they kept them largely to themselves. The Follings were generous donors to local causes, and Howard sat on influential charity boards. They were, by all outward appearances, model citizens. Then, in the winter of 1992, a new family moved to Millbrook. Michael and Susan Fletcher, with their teenage daughter Emily, took up residence just a few doors down. Michael was a journalist with the Millbrook Gazette. Susan was a social worker with child welfare experience. Mom noticed something off about the Follings kids right away, says Emily Fletcher, now in her 40s. She had worked with traumatized children and recognized the signs. The way they flinched at sudden movements, never made eye contact, always seemed to be watching Margaret out of the corners of their eyes. Susan Fletcher began documenting her observations and tried to befriend Margaret. Margaret was initially receptive, perhaps seeing a potential ally. The two women met for coffee, and occasionally Susan was invited to the Follings home. It was during one of these visits that Susan noticed something strange, says Emily. She told me about a room on the third floor. The door was always locked, but she could hear sounds, shuffling, sometimes crying. When she asked, Margaret said it was just storage, that the house made strange noises because it was old. But Mom didn't believe her. Susan's concerns grew when, in the spring of 1993, she spotted a child she didn't recognize peering from a third-floor window. A girl with long dark hair who vanished as soon as Susan looked up. When Susan mentioned this, Margaret laughed it off, saying it must have been Elizabeth or Catherine. But Susan had met all the Follings children and was certain this was someone new. Around the same time, Michael Fletcher was writing articles about adoption fraud. His research revealed several agencies had been shut down in the 1980s for illegally placing children without proper documentation. Dade never specifically connected this to the Follings, says Emily. But I remember him, Tom. The timeline matched when the Follings were adopting their first batch of kids. Whether by coincidence or design, shortly after Michael's articles were published, the Follings announced they were adopting again. This time, twins named Peter and Paul, followed by a girl named Mary, bringing their total to 11 children. Once again, the adoptions happened with surprising speed. Looking back, it's clear they were taking advantage of loopholes, says Cooper. They worked with different agencies, often in different states. They provided documentation from previous adoptions and specifically requested children from difficult backgrounds. Children with incomplete records, children who might slip through the cracks. But why? What motive could they have? According to those who knew them, Margaret's desire for a large family seemed genuine. Howard, though less overtly enthusiastic, appeared to indulge his wife. It wasn't about money. Cooper insists. The Follings were already wealthy. They didn't need adoption subsidies. And it wasn't about appearances. If anything, having such a large family made them stand out. The truth, when it finally emerged, was far more disturbing. In the fall of 1994, Susan Fletcher was diagnosed with breast cancer. By spring 1995, she was confined to home hospice care. Facing her mortality, she decided to share her suspicions with someone who could act. She called me to her bedside one night. Remembers Cooper, then a junior detective. She had a file, pages of notes on the Follings family, observations, inconsistencies, photographs of the house, including that third-floor window. She made me promise I would look into it after she was gone. Susan Fletcher died on June 12, 1995. Cooper kept his promise, though initially he proceeded with caution. The Follings were powerful. Accusations would not be taken lightly. Cooper began reviewing public records, property deeds, tax filings, and what little adoption information was available. Most adoption records were sealed. Cooper explains, but I confirmed they worked with at least 5 agencies across 3 states. And I found something else interesting. Each time they adopted, they made a substantial donation to the agency. Not illegal necessarily, but unusual. Cooper also discovered Howard had established a trust fund for each adopted child. On the surface, this seemed a loving gesture, ensuring financial security. But the terms were strange. The money was only accessible at age 25, and only if they maintained regular contact with their adoptive parents and didn't seek information about their biological origins. It was about control, Cooper says. Everything the Follings did was about control. Armed with this, Cooper took a more direct approach. He drove by the Follings house regularly, noting comings and goings. He interviewed neighbors, teachers, and former household employees. The staff never lasted long, Cooper notes. They'd work a few months, maybe a year, then suddenly leave town. No notice, no forwarding address. It was like they vanished. One former housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, had left in 1991 after just 6 months. Cooper tracked her to Ohio. Initially, she refused to speak, but when Cooper showed her Susan Fletcher's file, something changed. She started crying. Cooper recalls. She said, "So someone else knows." Then she started talking, and once she started, she couldn't stop. According to Vasquez, the Follings children were subjected to a strict regimen designed to break their spirits. They followed elaborate, constantly changing rules, making punishment inevitable. They were isolated, each in a separate bedroom, forbidden from entering others' rooms. They had to address Howard and Margaret as Sir and Madam, never Mom and Dad. But the worst thing, Cooper says, was what Maria told me about the 3rd floor. She said there were 3 always locked rooms. She left food outside 3 times a day, but was never allowed to see inside. She could hear children's voices, sometimes crying, sometimes singing. When she asked, Margaret said these were children with special needs requiring isolation. Vasquez finally left after witnessing Margaret punishing 11-year-old James for speaking during dinner without permission. The punishment involved forcing the boy to stand in a corner all night, with Margaret checking hourly to ensure he hadn't moved. Maria said she couldn't be part of it anymore. Cooper says, she packed that night and left before dawn. She was afraid not just of losing her job, but of what the Follings might do if they knew she disapproved. With Vasquez's testimony and Susan Fletcher's notes, Cooper felt he had enough for a formal investigation. He took his findings to his superior, Chief Raymond Wallace, expecting support. Instead, he was told to drop the matter. The chief said there wasn't enough evidence. Cooper recalls. He reminded me Howard was friends with the mayor, the DA, and half the town council. He suggested I was letting my friendship with the Fletchers cloud my judgment. Frustrated but undeterred, Cooper continued unofficially, working on his own time. He was particularly interested in the children allegedly kept on the 3rd floor. Children not among the 11 officially adopted. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Emily Fletcher. Now 19 and studying journalism, Emily had been researching missing children cases from regions where the Follings adopted. I found a pattern, Emily says. In at least 3 instances, when the Follings adopted a child from an area, another child went missing from that area within a month. These were always vulnerable children. Foster kids, migrant workers' children, kids from families dealing with addiction or poverty. Children who might not be missed right away. Emily shared her findings with Cooper, who used his law enforcement access to dig deeper. He discovered that in each case, the missing child had never been found, and the investigation had been cursory. It was like these kids didn't matter to the system. Cooper says bitterly, like they were disposable. Armed with this, Cooper bypassed Chief Wallace and took his case to the Pennsylvania State Police. He compiled a detailed report including Vasquez's testimony, Susan Fletcher's notes, Emily's research, and his own findings. He sent it to a contact at the state level, Lisa Harper, who worked with a task force on crimes against children. Harper took it seriously. Within a week, she secured a warrant to search the Follings residence. But obtaining the warrant was only the first hurdle. We knew we had to move quickly, Cooper explains. If the Follings had any warning, they might destroy evidence or harm the children. But we also knew they had connections. If word reached them, the operation could be compromised. Harper assembled a team of state troopers and federal agents. Cooper was included as a local liaison. The plan was to execute the warrant at dawn. On October 23, 1995, a convoy approached the Follings estate. Officers secured the perimeter before announcing their presence. Howard Foing, in a silk bathrobe, answered the door. He showed no surprise, Cooper says. He was expecting us. He invited us in as if we were guests. He was completely calm. Margaret was different. When she realized what was happening, she became hysterical, screaming, attacking an officer. She had to be restrained. The search began methodically. The 11 known Foing children were found in their bedrooms, all awake, dressed, sitting on their beds as if awaiting inspection. They didn't react to our presence, Harper later reported. Not with fear, not with curiosity. It was as if they had been emptied out. Officers attempted interviews but got only scripted responses. Even 17-year-old James would only say, "Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are happy here." The true horror was on the 3rd floor. As Vasquez testified, there were 3 locked rooms. When officers broke down the doors, they found 3 children, a girl about 10 and 2 boys around 8. Unlike the children downstairs, these reacted with terror, cowering and whimpering. The conditions were deplorable. Cooper says, the rooms were bare except for mattresses. Windows were covered with nailed blackout curtains. The smell was overwhelming. They had been living in their own filth. Medical exams revealed all 3 were severely malnourished and showed signs of physical abuse. None spoke English fluently, suggesting non-English speaking households. None appeared in any official record. No birth certificates, no adoption papers. They were ghosts, Cooper says, children who had been erased. The discovery transformed the case from suspected abuse to something far more sinister. The FBI was called, charges expanded to kidnapping, human trafficking, and falsification of federal documents. Howard and Margaret were arrested. As they were led away, Margaret broke free, ran to the staircase, and screamed in an unrecognizable language. Later analysis suggested glossolalia, speaking in tongues. That was when I first wondered if there was a religious component, Cooper says. It hinted at something ritualistic. With the Foings in custody, focus shifted to understanding their crimes and helping victims. The 3 hidden children went to emergency foster care, the 11 adopted children to a group home for traumatized youth. Interviewing them proved challenging. The adopted children maintained scripted responses. The hidden children were too traumatized, flinching at movements, refusing eye contact, hysterical when separated. It was as if they only trusted each other, says child psychologist Dr. Evelyn Marrow. Which made sense given what they endured. They had been isolated, their only human contact with each other and periodically Margaret, who visited to administer treatments. These treatments, as described through art therapy, involved Margaret forcing them to drink a bitter liquid that made them sleepy, then reciting prayers or incantations. Sometimes she drew symbols on their bodies with a dark liquid. The ritual aspect was undeniable, Dr. Marrow says. But we couldn't identify any known religious tradition. It seemed something Margaret created, a personal mythology. Meanwhile, Cooper and agents searched the house. In Howard's study, they found a hidden safe with falsified adoption papers and cash in various currencies. But the most disturbing find was a leather-bound journal in Margaret's hand, spanning nearly 20 years. It detailed her mission to create the perfect family. She believed children were born with sins needing purging. The process involved breaking their connection to birth families, stripping their identity, and reshaping them. She saw herself as a savior, Cooper says. In her mind, she wasn't abusing them, she was saving them, cleansing them of their past. The journal revealed Margaret classified children into 2 categories: the redeemable and the vessels. The redeemable were the 11 adopted children who could be purified through discipline and indoctrination. The vessels, the 3 found, plus others before, served a different purpose. According to Margaret, Vessels were children whose souls were too corrupted to be saved. Cooper explains. Instead, they were receptacles for sins purged from the redeemable. It was a twisted transference. She believed she could extract evil from one child and place it into another. This explained the treatments. Once a vessel was full, a state Margaret claimed to identify by looking into their eyes, they would be discarded. The journal referenced a resting place on the property where the filled ones sleep until Judgment Day. This led to the most gruesome phase, searching the grounds. In a wooded area, cadaver dogs alerted to undisturbed earth. Excavation revealed 5 children in shallow graves marked with small stones. The medical examiner estimated the oldest burial was around 1981, shortly after adopting James, the most recent less than a year old. All died from similar causes: malnutrition, dehydration, exposure. They had been neglected to death, Cooper says. Forensic anthropologists worked to identify them. 3 tentatively matched missing children reports: Maria Gomez 9, missing from a migrant camp in 1981, Tyrell Washington 7, missing from Pittsburgh in 1985, Alexi Petro 8, missing from Philadelphia in 1990. The other 2 remained unidentified, Jane Dauphine 1 and John Dauphine 3. That still haunts me, Cooper says. Those 2 kids, someone must have loved them, missed them. They died without names, buried without ceremony, as if they never existed. As evidence mounted, the case seemed irrefutable, but legal proceedings proved twisted. Howard hired high-powered attorneys to distance him from Margaret's actions, painting him as an unwitting participant, oblivious due to business travels. It was transparent, says prosecutor Meredith Lane. Howard wanted to save himself by sacrificing his wife, but evidence didn't support ignorance. He signed fraudulent papers, established controlling trust funds, built the locked rooms. He enabled it. Margaret was deemed incompetent to stand trial after evaluation revealed severe delusional disorder with religious preoccupation. She was committed to a psychiatric facility, where she died in 2008. Howard denied shifting all blame, changed tactics, negotiating a plea deal. He offered cooperation, information about other vessels, for a reduced sentence. It was gut-wrenching, Lane admits. We wanted harsh penalties, but bringing closure to more families was hard to ignore. A deal was struck. Howard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child endangerment, kidnapping, and falsification. He received 25 years to life, with parole possible after 20 years. His information led to 3 more burial sites on former properties: a lake house in New York, a cabin in West Virginia, a beach house in Maryland. In total, 8 more remains were recovered, bringing victims to 13. 13 vessels for 12 redeemable children, Cooper notes. In Margaret's logic, there had to be more vessels because some filled quicker. Of these 8, 5 were identified: Lucia Diaz, 9, Quame Johnson, 7, Trenon Gahan, 10, Sarah Blackfeather, 8, Dmitry Kowalski, 6. All were reported missing between 1983 to 1992, all from marginalized communities. The Follings were predators, Lane says. They targeted children who wouldn't be missed, exploiting systemic failures. The 12 redeemable children faced varied, often tragic fates. James committed suicide in 1998. Elizabeth developed severe anorexia, in and out of treatment. Thomas disappeared after turning 18, never found. Catherine died of a drug overdose in 2007 at 28. Some younger children were adopted by new families, others aged out of foster care. The damage was too deep, says Dr. Marrow. They were systematically brainwashed, their worth tied to purity achieved through suffering, not something undone with a few years of therapy. The 3 hidden children, Sofia Mateo and Carlos Herrera, ages 10, 8, and 8, were reunited with their family, migrant workers near San Diego. Their parents had reported them missing, but police suggested the family moved on. It was a miracle they were found alive, Cooper says. Based on Margaret's journal, Sophia was nearly filled. She would have been next. Howard died in prison in 2011, having served 16 years. He never expressed remorse, maintaining he was trying to help his wife. His estate, worth millions, was divided among survivors in a civil settlement. The Follings house was demolished in 1997. The land became a community garden. Each year on the arrest anniversary, Millbrook holds a vigil, lighting 13 lanterns for the vessels and 12 candles for the redeemable children. It's not enough, Cooper says. Nothing could be. But it's something. We remember. The case impacted adoption laws. The Follings Act, passed in Pennsylvania in 1998, requires rigorous background checks, limits adoptions per family within a time frame, and mandates home visits for 5 years post-adoption. The system failed these children. Lane says, we all failed them. Neighbors, doctors, officials, law enforcement. We should have taken Susan Fletcher's concerns seriously. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is that there might be more undiscovered victims. Howard's cooperation was limited to properties directly linked to the Follings. Given their travels, others likely exist. I've made peace will never know the full extent, Cooper says. But I haven't made peace that there are parents who still don't know. That's why I keep going back to the files. Those children deserve their names. In the garden where the house stood, 25 trees were planted, 12 oaks for the redeemable, 13 willows for the vessels. Each year they grow, reaching skyward. May we honor their courage with vigilance, Cooper says. May we ensure such horrors never again hide in plain sight. This has been the Liturgy of Slaves. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you have information about missing children, contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST. Sometimes, decades later, truth still comes to light. Until next time, stay vigilant. The darkest deeds often happen where we least expect.